Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Retold by Jenny Dooley and Virginia Evans. An Express Publishing Classic Reader. Copyright Express Publishing. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. New Neighbours.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man with a large fortune must be looking for a wife. And so, when such a wealthy young man moves into a neighborhood, the local families hope that one of their daughters will soon be married to him. One sunny autumn morning in their home at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet announced some important news.
Have you heard that Netherfield Park has been let at last? It's a wonderful opportunity for our girls.
When Mr. Bennet made no reply, Mrs. Bennet continued.
Don't you want to know who's taken it?
Mr. Bennet smiled ever so slightly as he responded to his wife.
You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it.
A wealthy single man by the name of Bingley is moving in.
Really? How does it affect our girls?
Mr. Bennet, you must know. I am hoping he will marry one of them. You should go and visit Mr. Bingley as soon as he moves in.
I don't think it's necessary for me to go. You and the girls can go if you like.
You know very well that we can't. Just think of what a marriage it would be for one of them. Even the Lucases are going, and as you know, they hardly ever go to welcome newcomers.
I don't see why you can't go instead. I'll send Mr. Bingley a note to give him my permission to marry whichever of them he chooses, although I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie.
You will do no such thing. Lizzie is no better than the others. She's not as pretty as Jane, or as outgoing as Lydia, and yet you always favour her.
Well, they're all silly and ignorant, of course, but Lizzie is a little quicker to understand things than her sisters.
Mr. Bennet, how can you speak of your children like that? You so enjoy teasing me, and have no concern for my nerves.
Despite what he had said to his wife, Mr. Bennet did visit Mr. Bingley on the day after Mr. Bingley moved in. That evening, he decided to break the news to his family in his own way. He noticed Elizabeth repairing a hat.
I hope Mr. Bingley will like that hat, Lizzie.
Mrs. Bennet responded before Lizzie could say a word.
But if we aren't going to visit Mr. Bingley, how will he ever see Lizzie's hat?
You're forgetting, Mamma, that we'll meet him at the public balls. Mrs. Long has promised to introduce us.
Mr. Bennet played along.
When is your next ball, Lizzie?
There's one in Meryton in 2 weeks' time.
This worried Mrs. Bennet.
But Mrs. Long will be away till the day before the ball. How can she introduce us when she won't yet know him herself? Oh, I'm sick of Mr. Bingley.
Mr. Bennet quite enjoyed the next moment.
I'm sorry to hear that. If you had told me, I wouldn't have visited him this morning. Now we cannot simply ignore him.
Mrs. Bennet and her daughter's concern turned to joy. Mr. Bingley was certain to be at the ball in Meryton. Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters had arrived early at the assembly rooms in Meryton. They were all eagerly awaiting the arrival of Mr. Bingley and his party. At last they came. Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, and 2 other men. Mr. Bingley was a friendly young man, and everyone found him pleasant. His sisters were very stylishly dressed, more so than any of the other women in the hall. One of the other men was Mr. Hurst, who was married to one of the sisters. But it was Mr. Darcy who attracted the most attention. He was tall and handsome, and rumours quickly spread that he was very wealthy. But people noticed his pride most of all. He did not want to meet any of the ladies, and danced only 2 dances, one with each of Mr. Bingley's sisters. Elizabeth Bennet watched Mr. Bingley's party from a distance. She enjoyed studying people and trying to make out their characters. Later, when she was talking with her older sister Jane, Mr. Bingley came up to be introduced. Now she found herself seated on her own, watching as Bingley danced with Jane. When the dance finished, Mr. Bingley came to talk with Mr. Darcy, who was standing close by. Elizabeth knew they were talking about her, and felt her heart pounding.
Come, Darcy, why aren't you dancing?
You know I dance only with women I know.
But there are several very pretty women here.
You are dancing with the only pretty girl in the place, Bingley.
Jane is very beautiful, but one of her sisters is just over there.
She's tolerable, I suppose, but not pretty enough to tempt me.
From that moment, Elizabeth disliked Mr. Darcy. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly. Mrs. Bennet was very happy that Mr. Bingley had danced with her eldest daughter, and that his sisters thought well of her. Jane herself was pleased about this, and Elizabeth was happy for her. Lydia and Catherine were excited to have danced all night. Mary had overheard someone praising her. So they all returned to Longbourn in good spirits. The following day, Jane was still very excited and could not wait to tell Elizabeth all about her evening.
Mr. Bingley is such a nice man, don't you think, Lizzie?
He certainly is, and handsome.
He's just what a man should be. He's outgoing, has a good sense of humour, and he asked me to dance with him twice. Such a compliment. I can hardly believe it.
A compliment, maybe, but one you deserved.
Of the many things that were said about the ball, some things were generally agreed upon, Elizabeth realized. Certainly Mr. Bingley was well liked by everyone, and his interest in Jane had been well received. Elizabeth would not be surprised if her beautiful sister found a husband in someone as well thought of as Mr. Bingley. Opinions differed more about Mr. Bingley's sisters, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. They were clearly well-dressed, well-mannered, and well-educated, and Jane thought highly of them. But to Elizabeth, they had seemed proud and self-important. Everyone seemed to agree that Mr. Darcy was full of pride, and even though he had good looks and wealth, Elizabeth promised herself that she would never dance with him, even if he asked her. She neither knew nor cared that Darcy was quite taken by her light figure and dark eyes. But Elizabeth wondered what the future would be for Bingley and Jane. In the days that followed, they saw each other quite often, although only in the company of others. Bingley's sisters liked Jane too, so maybe something would come of it. She hoped so, because she could see that her sister was falling in love.
Chapter 2. Jane's Illness.
A couple of weeks after the ball, Jane Bennet received a note from Miss Bingley. She was inviting Jane to have dinner with her and her sister Mrs. Hurst at Netherfield that evening. Jane was very happy to get an invitation from such important neighbours, even though Mr. Bingley would be out and she would not see him. Mrs. Bennet insisted that Jane go on horseback. It looked like rain, and if the weather turned bad, she would have to stay overnight. Then she would most likely see Mr. Bingley the next morning. The plan worked, and Jane did not return to Longbourn that night. The next morning, the Bennets received a note saying that Jane was ill, probably due to the weather, and would be staying at Netherfield until she was better. The note worried Elizabeth, and she set off straight away on foot through the muddy fields to Netherfield. When she arrived, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst were shocked that she had walked so far, and Elizabeth had the feeling that they disapproved of her.
How is Jane?
Miss Bingley responded coolly.
She's got a fever and is not well enough to leave her room.
The doctor called at the house a little later and told Jane to stay in bed. Elizabeth, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst sat by her bedside and kept her company. At 3 o'clock, Elizabeth said it was time for her to leave, and Miss Bingley offered to send for the carriage. Jane seemed disappointed. So Miss Bingley invited Elizabeth to stay until her sister was completely well. Elizabeth gratefully accepted the offer. She sent word to Longbourn to inform her family and asked them to send fresh clothes. That evening, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy returned to Netherfield just in time for dinner. Darcy said little, but Bingley was very concerned about Jane's condition. Though Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst asked after Jane's health, Elizabeth noticed that they were rather unconcerned about her sister when she was not present. Bingley's genuine concern, however, pleased her very much. After dinner, Elizabeth returned to Jane. Almost as soon as Elizabeth had left the room, Miss Bingley began to criticize her.
Did you see the state she was in when she arrived here? The mud must have been 6 inches deep on her clothes.
Mrs. Hurst agreed.
Dirty clothes, messy hair. I don't know why she came at all.
But Mr. Bingley saw it differently.
I think it shows that she really cares for her sister, to come all that way on foot.
Mrs. Hurst then shifted her remarks to Jane.
I have a high regard for Miss Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl. I hope she soon finds a good husband, but her chances must be poor with the kind of family she comes from and their lack of status.
Again, Mr. Bingley defended the Bennet sisters.
Whatever you say of their family, it doesn't make them any less good company.
Darcy then remarked on the situation.
But their family will certainly make it harder for them to find good husbands.
Bingley said nothing. But Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst seemed very pleased at Darcy's remark. The next day, Jane was no better, and Elizabeth asked that Mrs. Bennet come to visit. Naturally, Mrs. Bennet wanted Jane to remain at Netherfield for as long as possible. She hoped that her daughter's nearness to Mr. Bingley would increase the chances of a marriage between them. She opened the conversation.
You have a beautiful home, Mr. Bingley.
Thank you. I like living here.
As always, Elizabeth was observing human nature.
I think this house is in line with your personality.
Really? So you're a student of character?
I am. I enjoy trying to work out what makes someone the way they are.
Mr. Darcy then offered his own opinion about country living.
But in the country, you don't meet many different people to study. Certainly not as many people as you do in town.
Maybe not. But people change over time, and there's always something new to see in them.
Mrs. Bennet was displeased by Mr. Darcy's remarks about country life.
I quite assure you that there's just as much going on in the country as there is in town.
Everyone was surprised. And Darcy, after looking at Mrs. Bennet for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet sensed a victory.
The town's only advantage is its shops and public places. The country is much more beautiful, isn't it, Mr. Bingley?
When I'm here in the country, I want to stay here. But when I'm in town, I want to stay there. I like them both.
You're not like Mr. Darcy, then, for he sees nothing of value in the country.
Her mother's remark made Elizabeth feel very uncomfortable.
Mamma, you're mistaken. Mr. Darcy only said that there is a greater variety of people in town. You can't disagree with that.
Of course, my dear, but this part of the countryside also has a great many people. Why, we dine with 24 different families.
This statement, having little to do with the truth, left Elizabeth blushing, and she quickly changed the subject. Mrs. Bennet, however, failed to see the stupidity of her remarks, and for the next half hour she continued to embarrass everyone. When she finally left, it was a great relief to them all. That evening, Miss Bingley and her sister entertained the others by playing the piano. Elizabeth noticed that Mr. Darcy often looked at her, but she put the possibility out of her mind that such a man would be attracted to her, especially after what he had said at the Meryton ball. So why he might look at her so much, she had little idea. However, since she did not care at all for him, it did not really matter whether he looked at her or not. After some Italian songs, Miss Bingley started playing lively Scottish music. At this point, Mr. Darcy stood and came over to where Elizabeth was sitting.
Are you tempted to dance, Miss Bennet?
She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question, a little surprised by her silence.
I heard you before, but I couldn't decide what to say. I know you wanted me to say yes, but only so that you could have made fun of me for having such bad taste. And so I'll say no to your question. Look down on me if you dare.
Indeed, I do not dare.
Darcy then calmly returned to where he had been sitting. It surprised Elizabeth that he was not annoyed when she refused to dance with him. The next day, Jane began to feel a lot better. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst joined Elizabeth once more at Jane's bedside, and they talked until dinner. After dinner, they stayed downstairs, leaving Jane to sleep. When the gentleman entered the room,
It's a pleasure to see you again,
Miss Bingley started to pay Mr. Darcy a lot of attention. But Darcy was not interested, and chose to write a letter to his sister. Miss Bingley then walked about the room and tried to attract Darcy's attention, but he did not look up from his letter. So she turned to Elizabeth for help.
Miss Eliza Bennet, would you like to join me for a walk round the room?
Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed. Now that Elizabeth was walking too, Darcy looked up, and Miss Bingley took the opportunity to speak.
Would you like to join us, Mr. Darcy?
No, there could be only two reasons why you two might choose to walk around the room. And for either of these two reasons, I would be interfering if I joined you, Miss Bingley.
Whatever do you mean?
Well, you might be walking about the room because you want a private conversation with each other. In that case, my presence would intrude on your privacy. Or you might want to show off your figure. In that case, I have a far better view from here.
Really? I never heard anything so shameful.
Miss Bingley turned to Elizabeth.
What shall we do to punish him?
I think we should make fun of him.
In what way?
Elizabeth pretended to think for a moment.
Well, that's a difficult matter. We must find a fault in his character and pick on that. But perhaps there are no faults in his character.
Darcy was almost amused.
I think you're flattering me. I try hard to hide any faults that might make someone laugh at me.
Such as vanity and pride?
Yes, vanity is a fault, but pride is different. If the mind is superior, then pride can be hidden.
At this reply, Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile, and Miss Bingley asked her final opinion on the matter.
So, Miss Bennet, what is your decision?
I'm totally convinced that Mr. Darcy has no faults.
I have many faults. For example, once my good opinion of someone is lost, it is lost forever.
Elizabeth could not hold back.
That is a weakness indeed. To be so unforgiving is a major fault. But you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it.
Darcy was ready with a reply.
Nobody is perfect.
Elizabeth shot back a response of her own.
And your fault is to hate everybody.
And your fault is to willfully misunderstand them.
Miss Bingley was now tired of a conversation from which she had been left out.
Do let us have some music.
The next day, Jane was well enough to travel, and she and Elizabeth returned home to Longbourn.
Chapter 3. Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham.
The next day, Mr. Bennet told the family of a letter he had received from a cousin, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins had requested to come and stay with them for a week. He was the only other male in all the Bennet family, and so was to inherit Longbourn after Mr. Bennet's death. Mr. Collins was a priest who lived in Kent, and none of the Bennet family had ever met him before. His letter was a strange one, as it was full of apologies and expressions of discomfort regarding the Longbourn inheritance situation. It also spoke in several places in the most radiant terms of his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The Bennet family therefore expected a slightly strange man. When Mr. Collins arrived, he did indeed fulfill these expectations. His conversation was clumsy, and he apologized often for his unintended insults. The Bennets later learnt the reason for his visit. On the suggestion of Lady Catherine, Mr. Collins was looking for a wife, and he had decided to find one amongst the Bennet girls. It was his idea of making amends for inheriting their father's estate, and he had heard of their beauty. He was particularly attracted by Jane's beauty. However, Mrs. Bennet told him that Jane was likely to be very soon engaged, and so he switched his attentions to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet, now realizing Mr. Collins' marriage intentions, did everything she could to encourage him, but Elizabeth did not at first realize what was going on. The next evening there was a dinner at Mrs. Phillips' house. Mrs. Phillips was Elizabeth's aunt, who lived in Meryton. All the girls were to go, along with Mr. Collins. But the younger two, Lydia and Kitty, were especially interested in meeting the army officers who would be there. A regiment had set up camp near Meryton, and they often saw the red-coated soldiers in the streets. Lydia in particular was taken with the men in uniform. For Elizabeth, the evening was notable for a long conversation with one of these officers, a Mr. Wickham. It was after dinner had finished, and everyone else had been drawn to the card tables. But Wickham and Elizabeth sat alone. In the conversation, Netherfield was mentioned, and Elizabeth discovered that Wickham knew Mr. Darcy. Wickham inquired as to the length of Darcy's stay. Elizabeth knew him.
He's a month, and I know him as much as I ever wished to. I've spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I don't like him at all.
Wickham declared that he too was not fond of Darcy.
I grew up with him, but I don't get on well with him either, although his father, the late Mr. Darcy, was the most wonderful man I have ever met. Mr. Darcy paid for me to train to become a priest, but when he died, Darcy went against his father's wishes and prevented me from taking up my intended post. I was left no choice but to join the army.
That's shocking. Darcy deserves to be publicly disgraced.
Yes, and one day he will be. But not by me. I cannot easily forget the kindness of his father. The hardest thing for me to bear is that I never did anything wrong.
But why did he behave so cruelly?
Wickham had an answer ready.
I think it comes down to jealousy. Or maybe it's simply pride.
Elizabeth heartily agreed.
Pride, yes. Everyone thinks that he's proud.
Maybe he couldn't bear the thought of my having something granted by his father.
Elizabeth was horrified by this story. She had never imagined that Darcy could have done what Wickham had told her. But the story certainly confirmed her own impression of him, that Darcy was not the sort of man she wanted to associate with. Wickham and Elizabeth went on talking for most of the evening. They talked about Meryton and its people and the area. Elizabeth found him very charming and was looking forward to meeting him again. A ball was to be held at Netherfield in 2 days' time, and Mr. Bingley had invited all the officers. It turned out to be a magnificent event, but all its magnificence was of little concern to Elizabeth. She searched for Wickham amongst the guests, but he was nowhere to be seen. At last she discovered that he had had to go to London on business and would not be attending the ball. She had not got over the disappointment of Wickham's absence when the dancing began. Suddenly, Mr. Darcy came up to her and asked her to dance. Caught off guard, she agreed and found herself dancing with a man she disliked greatly. For a while they danced in silence, but then Elizabeth decided that she would speak.
I met an old friend of yours, Mr. Wickham. A very nice gentleman.
Elizabeth's respect for Wickham concerned Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Wickham has indeed got a pleasant manner that ensures he makes many friends, but he has a problem keeping them.
He certainly has lost your friendship, and that has proven very costly for him.
At this, Darcy became noticeably uncomfortable. They finished the dance in silence. Only a few minutes after the dance had ended, Miss Bingley came up to Elizabeth.
I hear that you've met Mr. Wickham, and that he has been telling you stories. I have no doubt that anything he said was highly critical of Mr. Darcy, but I can tell you myself that Mr. Darcy is a fine and honest person.
Elizabeth did not believe Miss Bingley. For Elizabeth, Darcy's pride was noticeable in everything he said, and anyone so proud was likely to have unpleasant relationships with others. So it was very easy for her to believe what Wickham had said. Later, Elizabeth went to find Jane to see if she knew anything about Wickham. Jane's response favoured Darcy.
Mr. Bingley hasn't heard the whole of the story, but he has no doubt that Darcy has not done anything wrong.
Elizabeth pursued the notion further.
Does Bingley know Wickham personally?
No.
So Bingley's version of the situation must have come from Darcy. I'm sure Mr. Bingley is being totally honest about what he knows. But since he knows only what Darcy has told him, I've no doubt that it is not totally truthful.
It all made total sense to Elizabeth. She was convinced that Darcy had wronged Wickham in a shameful way.
Chapter 4. A Wedding.
Before breakfast the next day, Mr. Collins made his move. Seeing Mrs. Bennet with Elizabeth and Kitty, he approached them.
Mrs. Bennet, would you mind if I had a private word with Elizabeth?
Yes, of course. Come on, Kitty. We have to go upstairs.
As soon as Mrs. Bennet and Kitty had gone, Mr. Collins began. He spent several minutes explaining to Elizabeth that he was now at the time of life when he needed a wife. Since he had established himself in a profession and had a nice home in Kent which needed looking after, he thought he must look for a wife immediately. He boldly expected a positive response.
You'll be very happy there.
I think you're being a little hasty, Mr. Collins. Thank you for your offer, but I'm afraid it's impossible for me to accept.
Come now. I know it's the custom for you young ladies to refuse the first offer, but just think what it is you're turning down?
I have thought about it as long as I need, Mr. Collins, and thinking about it more will not make it any more attractive.
But for several more minutes, Mr. Collins tried to persuade her, until finally she left him to go to her room. 10 minutes later, Elizabeth was summoned to the library to speak with her father.
Lizzie, tell me. I understand that Mr. Collins has proposed to you. Is that true?
She nodded.
And you refused him?
Yes.
Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother insists upon you accepting it, don't you, Mrs. Bennet?
Yes, or I will never see her again.
This leaves you with an unfortunate choice. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do.
Elizabeth could not help smiling. But her mother was beside herself, and complained bitterly for a long time. She tried to persuade Elizabeth to change her mind, but without success. Later that morning, Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, arrived to spend the day at Longbourn. Lydia rushed out to tell her the news.
I'm glad you came because there's been so much fun going on here. Mr. Collins proposed to Elizabeth, but she won't have him.
In the breakfast room, Mrs. Bennet put her side of the matter to Charlotte.
You must convince her. No one is on my side. No one feels for my poor nerves.
At that moment, Elizabeth and Jane entered the room, and Mrs. Bennet went on.
Ah, here she is, completely carefree and unconcerned. But I'm telling you, Miss Lizzie, if you carry on refusing every marriage proposal you get, you'll never find a husband. And I won't be able to support you once my husband is dead.
Mrs. Bennet carried on in this way until Mr. Collins came in. Mr. Collins' pride was hurt by Elizabeth's rejection, but not his feelings, as he never was in love with her. He handled the situation by refusing to speak to her for the rest of his stay. Fortunately for everyone, Charlotte engaged him in lengthy conversation, drawing his attention away from the situation, and Longbourn became more peaceful. The next day, a letter arrived for Jane. It was from Miss Bingley. Jane read it out to Elizabeth.
She says that they're all leaving Netherfield for the winter. Mr. Bingley had to go straight away to London and...
So suddenly?
Oh, Lizzie, I won't see him for the whole winter.
Jane turned back to the letter. Suddenly, her face dropped.
There's more. She says that she has good reason to believe that Mr. Bingley is interested in Georgiana, Mr. Darcy's sister.
Elizabeth thought for a moment, and then gave her sister her opinion.
I think Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you, but she wants him to marry Miss Darcy instead. She will probably follow him to London in the hope of keeping him there, and try to persuade you that he does not care about you.
Miss Bingley would never try to deceive me like that.
Elizabeth had her own ideas.
Perhaps then she is deceiving herself.
Nevertheless, there was no doubt that Bingley was leaving Netherfield for the winter. This alone was disastrous news for Jane, and for many days she could not be comforted. The same day the letter arrived, the Bennets and Mr. Collins went to visit the Lucases. Once again, Charlotte Lucas spent most of the day talking to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth was grateful that her friend had occupied him and thanked her for it. But for Charlotte, there was more at stake than merely keeping Mr. Collins happy or keeping his attention away from Elizabeth. She was actually trying to redirect Mr. Collins' attentions onto herself. Indeed, her scheme was working well, and if he weren't leaving Hertfordshire so soon, she felt certain she would succeed. The next morning, Mr. Collins sneaked out of Longbourn soon after dawn and walked towards the Lucases' house, for he had a similar scheme. Charlotte saw him approaching from an upstairs window and rushed outside to intercept him in the lane. There, in the shortest speech that Mr. Collins had ever made, they became engaged. On returning to the house, Charlotte's parents swiftly and joyfully gave their consent to the marriage. It came as a complete surprise to Elizabeth that her friend would accept Mr. Collins's proposal, and she demanded an explanation when Charlotte told her about the engagement.
How could you?
Well, I hope that in time you'll come to understand why I did it. I've never been a romantic, and Mr. Collins is offering me a comfortable life. I think I have a very good chance of being happy.
Elizabeth was filled with disbelief. Just 3 days after Mr. Collins had proposed to her, he had proposed to someone else. But her surprise at this was nothing compared to her amazement that Charlotte could consider marrying purely for money, and she wondered if their friendship could ever be the same. She also felt sad in her certainty that her friend would never be happy in the life she had chosen. The days came and went. Elizabeth saw a lot of Mr. Wickham and enjoyed his company. Jane tried not to show it, but she was broken-hearted over Mr. Bingley. As Christmas approached, Elizabeth's aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, from London, came to stay at Longbourn. Elizabeth had always had a good relationship with Mrs. Gardiner and confided in her all her hopes and concerns about Jane and Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Gardiner suggested that Jane come and stay with her after their visit to help her get over him. She also thought that Elizabeth's relationship with Wickham was highly unlikely to come to anything, and advised her not to encourage him and to see him less often. After considering her aunt's point of view, Elizabeth could see the sense in it and took her advice. Mrs. Gardiner also suggested to Elizabeth that she go with them to Derbyshire in the summer. Elizabeth agreed immediately. In January, not long after the Gardiners had returned to London, Mr. Collins returned to Hertfordshire for his wedding. After the wedding, he and Charlotte would live at his home in Hunsford in Kent. Charlotte invited Elizabeth to come to stay with them for a visit in March. She accepted the invitation, although she doubted that it would be particularly enjoyable. She felt that she and Charlotte would never be the close friends they used to be. As the weeks passed, the visit to Kent looked more attractive to Elizabeth, especially when she discovered that Mr. Wickham had become very interested in another young woman. This woman, a Miss King, had the enormous advantage of having a dowry worth £10,000. Elizabeth could not compete with such wealth. If nothing else, Elizabeth was now certain that Wickham had no interest in marrying her, and she did not think ill of either him or Miss King. Jane had returned with her aunt and uncle to London and wrote to Elizabeth regularly. She had seen Miss Bingley only once in the last month and found her cool and distant. She had not seen Mr. Bingley at all, and Elizabeth suspected that his sister had not informed him that Jane was in town.
Chapter 5. A Month in Kent.
In March, as planned, Elizabeth went to stay with Charlotte and her new husband in Hunsford in Kent. When she arrived at the parsonage, she was greeted warmly by both. She was shown round the house, and then they took a walk in the extensive gardens. As they walked, Mr. Collins had some news to announce.
We have all been invited to go to Rosings tomorrow evening.
Rosings was Lady Catherine de Bourgh's nearby estate. Mr. Collins went on about Lady Catherine's fine qualities.
It will be a privilege which I'm sure you'll enjoy. Lady Catherine truly is a remarkable lady. In fact, we dine there twice a week.
Lady Catherine's home was the largest and grandest that Elizabeth had ever seen, and the dinner matched the house in its elegance and proportion. Lady Catherine talked a lot, and about a great variety of things. She asked Elizabeth numerous questions about her family and her background, and asked Charlotte to tell her everything that was happening in her life. Lady Catherine's daughter, Anne, was very quiet. She was about 15, but was very small and thin for her age, and appeared pale and sickly. Elizabeth found two things about that evening disturbing. The first was Lady Catherine's insistence upon knowing her age, which Elizabeth was very reluctant to say. But Lady Catherine was not someone who people normally stood up to, and Elizabeth finally told her. The second was her discovery that Mr. Darcy was Lady Catherine's nephew. Lady Catherine spoke well of him, and it was not too surprising to Elizabeth when Lady Catherine added that Mr. Darcy would soon marry her daughter. But when Elizabeth looked at Anne and saw a very weak and ill child, she doubted that Anne would be the sort of wife that Darcy would want to have. But Lady Catherine seemed certain that it would happen, saying that Darcy and Anne were destined to marry. It was not long before Darcy came. He did not come alone, however, but with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. As the evening progressed, it became clear that she much preferred to talk with her nephews, and especially Darcy. Elizabeth found herself talking with Fitzwilliam, and it was indeed a very pleasant conversation. In fact, after a while it attracted Lady Catherine's attention.
What are you talking about to Miss Bennet, Fitzwilliam? Let me hear what it is.
We're talking about music, madam.
About music? Then let's hear it. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than I, or a better natural taste. If I'd ever learnt, I would have been an expert pianist.
Colonel Fitzwilliam responded agreeably.
I don't doubt it. Meanwhile, I've managed to persuade Miss Bennet to play for us.
Elizabeth went to the piano and started to play. Darcy approached the piano and stood so he had a clear view of Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth smiled and addressed him.
Do you mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy? I can be very stubborn when put in such situations, and my courage rises when I'm being bullied.
I won't say that you're mistaken because I know you don't really think I'm trying to bully you. And I've known you long enough to know that you often like to express opinions which in fact are not your own.
Elizabeth laughed at this description of herself. Then she turned to Colonel Fitzwilliam.
I see your cousin has an unkind notion of me, and will teach you not to believe a word I say. And Mr. Darcy, I don't think it's very nice to mention what you learned of my character in Hertfordshire. It is also unwise, since I might retaliate and say something that will shock your relations.
Darcy smiled.
I'm not afraid of you.
Colonel Fitzwilliam joined in.
I think you should tell us what you know of him. I'd like to know how he behaves with others.
Well, prepare yourself to hear something dreadful. The first time I saw Mr. Darcy was at a ball, and there he danced only 2 times all night, even though there were far more ladies than gentlemen.
Darcy was quick to defend himself.
I did not know anyone but my own small party.
True, but you could have been introduced.
Perhaps you are right, but I feel uncomfortable meeting new people.
Neither Elizabeth nor Fitzwilliam was going to let him get away with an easy answer.
Shall we ask your cousin the reason for this?
I can tell you myself. He simply can't be bothered to make the effort it requires.
Darcy again came to his own defense.
I am not as able as others to talk easily with people I have never met before.
Elizabeth's reply was quick and clever.
Perhaps, but my fingers do not play this piano with the same expert manner as many other women do. I lack the skill to play quickly or with great expression. I've always thought this was my own fault, because I do not practice enough, and not because I lack the ability to play better.
Mr. Darcy smiled.
You're quite right, of course. Neither of us performs for strangers.
But at this point their conversation was interrupted by Lady Catherine. Again, she was curious as to the topic of conversation and wanted to know why Elizabeth had stopped playing. Elizabeth immediately started playing again, and Lady Catherine came closer.
Miss Bennet plays well, but she would play much better if she practiced more.
Over the next few days, Elizabeth saw a lot of Mr. Darcy and his relations. One morning, when she was out for a walk alone, Elizabeth ran into Colonel Fitzwilliam. Since they were both heading to the parsonage, they walked together and chatted. Elizabeth spoke first.
You're leaving on Saturday, I hear.
Yes, if Darcy doesn't put it off again.
I imagine Darcy brought you here mainly to have some company. I'm surprised he doesn't marry, because then he would have constant companionship. But perhaps his sister is good enough company for the time being, and as she's under his sole care, he can tell her what to do.
Colonel Fitzwilliam clarified a point for Elizabeth.
Actually, I have joint responsibility with him for his sister.
Do you really? Tell me, is she difficult? 16 is a difficult age, and if she has the true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way.
Fitzwilliam looked at her intensely, in a way which suggested to Elizabeth that Georgiana was indeed difficult to manage. But she reassured him.
You needn't worry. I've not heard anything about Miss Darcy misbehaving. In fact, I've heard only good things.
Darcy takes good care of her, as he does with all his friends.
Elizabeth was a little surprised.
Does he really? And the same for all his friends?
Yes. For example, a few days ago he told me that he had saved one of his friends from an unwise marriage.
Really? Did he say why he thought the marriage unwise?
All he said was that there were some strong objections towards the lady.
Elizabeth's thoughts turned suddenly to Mr. Bingley, and this raised her curiosity.
Did he say which friend?
No, though I thought it might have been Bingley. It's the kind of mistake Bingley would make.
When Elizabeth had time to reflect on this conversation, she concluded that it was very likely that this friend Darcy had saved was indeed Bingley, and that the lady from whom Bingley had been saved must have been Jane. If this were the case, then she was right in thinking Bingley had wanted to marry Jane, but now it seemed that the only thing that had prevented his proposing was Darcy's advice. But what objections could Darcy possibly raise against Jane? They could only be, Elizabeth thought, to do with her family and its lack of wealth and connections. Then she remembered the letter that Miss Bingley had sent to Jane.
She says that she has good reason to believe
which had claimed that her brother was attracted to Miss Darcy. Perhaps this gave Darcy another reason for stopping Bingley from proposing to Jane, one that had nothing to do with her. Perhaps Darcy merely wanted Bingley to marry his sister. She decided that Darcy must have acted partly out of the worst kind of pride and partly out of the wish to keep Bingley for his sister. These thoughts angered Elizabeth greatly, and her opinion of Mr. Darcy worsened.
Chapter 6. Darcy opens his heart.
Elizabeth's conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam had left her a little shaken. Although that afternoon she and Charlotte and Mr. Collins had been invited to go to Rosings for tea, she did not feel up to it. It was partly the thought of having to see Darcy, and knowing now that it was he who had convinced Bingley not to marry Jane. She developed a headache, so she stayed at the parsonage alone. When the doorbell rang, a couple of hours later, Elizabeth thought it might be Colonel Fitzwilliam, come to see if she were better. She was wrong. It was Darcy. She just stood there in amazement as he strode into the drawing room of the parsonage.
They said that you were unwell. Are you any better?
A little better, thank you.
Darcy sat down, said nothing, then, after half a minute, stood again and walked around the room. Elizabeth did not know what to say. There were often silences when they were alone together, but this time he seemed particularly nervous. Finally, he spoke.
I have struggled against my feelings, but they won't go away. I must tell you how passionately I love you.
She was speechless. She just stared at him, not entirely certain that she had heard him correctly.
I know there's a real difference between the wealth of my family and yours, and I know that my feelings for you seem to go against all reason, but they are real nonetheless. I have done everything in my power, but my feelings for you are so strong that they have completely got the better of me. I hope they will now be rewarded by your hand in marriage.
Elizabeth felt herself blushing. She knew, of course, that she would never accept his proposal. But for a moment, she felt sorry for him, since she knew the pain of rejection would be great. However, as he continued to talk of how he loved her, despite her lower social standing and the shame it would bring him, she became angry.
If I felt grateful, I should thank you for the compliment, but I cannot. I have never wanted your attention, and I do not want to marry you.
Darcy, of course, resented her rejection.
And is this all you are going to say? Why do you refuse me so rudely?
Why did you choose to tell me that you love me against your will, against all reason? That was hardly a compliment. And how could you ever think I would accept a man who has ruined my sister's chances of happiness, perhaps forever? Or do you deny that you had anything to do with that?
I do not deny it. I think it was the right thing to do, and saved Bingley from an unfortunate mistake. I helped him, but could not help myself.
But it is not only this that makes me dislike you. What you did to Mr. Wickham is shameful. You've ruined the best years of his life and denied him his independence.
Darcy now strode around the room.
So this is your opinion of me. Thank you for explaining it so fully. Perhaps my honesty about how I tried not to love you has offended you.
You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy. Even if you had behaved more like a gentleman just now, I would still have refused. From the very first time I met you, you have been proud and high-handed beyond belief. You clearly don't care about the feelings of others. In fact, I had not known you a month before I felt you were the last man in the world I would ever marry.
Darcy had now stopped striding. He appeared surprised at her words.
Thank you. You've been very clear about your feelings. I won't take up any more of your time.
And with that, he turned and strode towards the door and left the house. Then Elizabeth sat down exhausted and cried for half an hour. The next morning, Elizabeth went for her usual walk. This time she had much to think about. A marriage proposal from Darcy. She was still amazed. Suddenly she heard her name being called.
Miss Bennet?
She turned. It was Darcy. She started walking away, but he caught up with her and thrust a letter towards her.
Please read this. I can assure you that Colonel Fitzwilliam can back up everything I have written.
Instinctively she took it. As soon as he was out of sight, Elizabeth opened the letter. She was curious, but did not expect to enjoy whatever was written within.
Dear Miss Bennet, do not be alarmed by this letter. I do not intend to hurt you or embarrass myself. by repeating anything that was said last night. There were 2 accusations that you made for which I wish to explain my actions and my motives. The first concerns my advice to Bingley not to propose to your sister Jane. I first became aware of the closeness of their relationship at the Netherfield ball. I watched them closely that evening and noticed that although your sister seemed to enjoy Bingley's company, she was also holding something back. My conclusion was that she did not really care for him. However, from what you said to me yesterday, I must have been wrong. I also believed that your family, if I may be so bold, was a problem. In terms of wealth and social standing, it is of course much lower than Bingley's, but there is also the matter of the embarrassing behavior of your mother and your younger sisters. As a result of these concerns, I advised Bingley that marrying your sister would not be in his best interests, and convinced him that she did not feel as deeply for him as he did for her. My only other involvement in this matter was that I did not tell him that I knew your sister was in London. I admit this was low of me, but it was done with the best intention, out of friendship. If I hurt your sister's feelings, I did not know it. Your second accusation, that I have mistreated Mr. Wickham, is unfair. But I will tell you the facts so that you can judge for yourself. After my father died about 5 years ago, Mr. Wickham told me that he had decided against a career in the church and had decided to study law instead. He asked me for money to support him, and I gave him £3,000. But it turned out that he never studied at all and lived a life of excess and laziness. 3 years later, he asked for more money when he had used up all his money on high living, but I refused him. Last year, though, he managed to win the affection of my sister Georgiana when she was being educated in London. She was only 15, but he convinced her to elope with him. Fortunately, she told me about her plans 2 days before, and of course I swiftly put an end to them. I have no doubt that all he wanted was her money and revenge on me. Wickham had a lot to gain, of course, since my sister has a large fortune of £30,000. I hope you will keep all of this to yourself, since I am sure you can imagine the kind of damage it might cause my sister and me.
She folded up the letter and decided not to look at it again. But 2 minutes later, she opened the letter again and started to reread it. She considered again what Darcy said about Wickham. If it was true, then Darcy had done little wrong. The very fact that Darcy had said that Colonel Fitzwilliam would back up everything in the letter made her think he may be telling the truth. She recalled the evening she had talked with Wickham. Now something occurred to her that she had not thought of before. What Wickham had told her now seemed too personal to tell a total stranger, as she had been to him then. That made Wickham's whole account suspicious, but also Wickham's recent involvement with Miss King began to appear suspicious. Perhaps he was concerned only with getting his hands on her money, and didn't care for her at all. So Elizabeth thought to herself,
I've been so prejudiced against Mr. Darcy and for Wickham. I missed signs that would have revealed Wickham's dishonesty.
She felt ashamed of herself. With a changed attitude, she read again the part of the letter in which Darcy discussed Jane.
My conclusion was that she did not really care for him. However, from what
She
you
understood that Jane did tend to conceal her feelings more than most people. Indeed, it might well be possible that someone like Darcy, who did not know Jane well, would fail to recognize the strong feelings she had for Bingley. When Elizabeth finally returned to the parsonage over 2 hours later, her opinion of Darcy had changed greatly. She found that both Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam had called while she was out and had now left Rosings.